Hi, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, Sweden is removing all mentions of race from their laws. What will this mean for the fight against racism? There are some discussions that we have on the stream where even if you're watching, you may not be in the same part of the country that we're talking about, that you are going to have an opinion. Today, I think this might be the case. Lika Bilal, she's looking out for your online feedback. What are you seeing?
Well, I actually love that you set it up that way because I want to share two varying opinions.
Right.
We have community on both sides of this on whether or not race should be removed. And from abroad, we have this tweet. This is Sally, who says, "We're all members of the same species. Our differences are solely visual. Thus, race is a social construct." She's tweeting from Greenville, South Carolina, here in the States. And this is a tweet from Malmo, Sweden. Stina says, "Flash, removing mentions of race doesn't automatically remove racism. The main problem is still ignored." We'll discuss both of those views on today's show, but we can't do it without you. So tweet us your questions and comments with hashtag AJStream.
Hi, I'm Bob Churchill. I work with the International Humanist and Ethical Union, and I'm in the stream.
What would happen if there were no mentions of race in the law? Sweden's Integration Minister Erik Ullenhag recently announced that all references to race would be removed from Swedish law. He argues that race is a social construct which carries negative connotations leading to prejudice. But not everybody agrees. Those who oppose the plan are concerned that this decision is turning a blind eye to racial discrimination in the country and sets back the fight against racism. So what does this all mean for Swedish society? To help us figure this out, we're joined by Ketimbwa Sabuni. He is Secretary General of the Afro-Swedish National Association. Eva Arpi is an editor with Neo magazine. That's a centre-right magazine that covers politics. Tobias Hübinette is a researcher with a multicultural centre and an anti-racism activist. And David Linden is editorial writer with Boris Tidning, and that's a daily newspaper in the city of Borås. So gentlemen, it is great to have you all here in the stream. I'm going to start with something that's incredibly important, and that is the way that race is used in Sweden. So Ketimbwa, help us understand this. The word race is slightly different in Sweden than it is elsewhere in the world. Can you explain?
I wouldn't say that actually, but it's true that in Sweden they don't talk about race that much. But it's because that we don't like to talk about racism in Sweden. We like to talk about things like tolerance and other stuff, and not about social and economical inequality in relation to race. And now what the integration minister is trying to do is trying to definitely bury that kind of analysis in order for us not to be able to see that the binary opposition in a racist society is that between the people who have access to rights and privileges because of their race and those who don't. So instead we're supposed to think that this is about race biology, something that no one believes in anymore.
All right, so David and Eva are ready to go right at that part of the conversation. Let's start with Eva. And Eva, can you tell me, teach me some Swedish here, race in Swedish, what is that word?
Ras.
Okay, what does that exactly mean?
It's basically the same as race, but in Swedish it's also, for example, if you're talking about dogs in English, you're talking about different dog breeds or horse breeds, but in Swedish, race is the same word. So breed and race is the same word.
Okay.
So it has a very sort of animalistic connotation as well. And I would just like to add that it's sort of strange, because when I argue about that you should not talk about race so much because it doesn't exist, human races. My harshest critics are from the extreme right and the extreme left, because both want the state to have more statistics based on race in Sweden. They want people to identify more as their skin color. So it's sort of ironic that the extremes meet in this issue.
Okay,
like Ketimbwa Sabuni, for instance.
All right, David, go ahead.
And it's also the fact. It's also the fact that every time Ketimbwa Sabuni talks on Swedish TV, he attacks Ivar Arpi. And even to the introduction to this program, he says that Ivar Arpi is the person that talks about race. Ivar Arpi doesn't care.
So David, let's set some rules for this conversation. Gentlemen, hold tight for a moment. Gentlemen, hold tight for a moment. I usually don't have to say this so early on in the program. All right, we're coming to this conversation fresh for us. So let's not hark back to Swedish television and other appearances you may have made together. Meanwhile, what are we seeing online?
Well, in talking about the definition of this term and what it really means in the Swedish context, we got several responses. Zach is one of them. He says the term is loaded because Swedes haven't really dealt with its racist history, Zach says. We also have this tweet from McAlum, who says Sweden is right in saying that the concept of race is a social construct, but racial issues and tensions exist now, and you can't retroactively fix the issue. It's a good law. It's a few centuries late. I want to share one more. And Katimba, I'll give this one to you. GETTY writes in saying that the problem with this is that it gives the illusion that Sweden has moved into a post-racial society, simultaneously stopping any discussion about race. Do you think that that is part of the reasoning behind this, the government's reasoning, looking towards a post-racial society?
Most definitely. So what the government is trying to do is definitely bury this discussion. And if you don't have that kind of analysis where race as a social category is used, you can't even address the kind of racism that the likes of Ivar Arpi is peddling every day from one of our leading newspapers, where he says the most outrageous things about Muslims, and then he calls it criticism of religion. But
Ivar hasn't said anything yet for us to actually feel that it's outrageous. And I told you again that we're coming to this afresh. I do not want it to be tit for tat. Otherwise, we're really not going to get very far. So hold tight for a moment.
Let's keep Arpi out of this.
Yes. Okay. So hold tight for a moment, because otherwise it makes you all sound incredibly petty. All right. So let's head back to my. Exactly, I don't think you are either. This is the voice of Erik Ullenhag. He's the Swedish Minister for Integration. We spoke to him just in the last few hours and asked him about the idea behind the removing the actual word of race from legislation in Sweden. This is what he told us.
My basic idea when we fight racism in Sweden is that we should treat human beings just as human beings, and every person. The best way of fighting racism is to treat every individual as an individual, and then we should find a legislation where we don't use this unmodern term in Sweden, in the Swedish language, because it is unmodern.
What do you make of that as an idea, Tobias? Do you think that the government's intentions are very honourable and they actually have a good intent behind this?
Well, my objection to this decision to remove race from Swedish legislation and consequently from language itself is both academic and legal. Academically because, basically the whole world speaks about race outside of Sweden. And legally because the removal of race from legislation makes it impossible to litigate and to even deal with issues that are not always based on, for example, the religion or language or culture, but are purely based on physical aspects, that is race.
Sure. Eva, what did you want to say?
But it's sort of a misconception here, because they're not removing skin color from the legislation. So they're removing race because race is not a. They don't want to encourage us to think about race in that way. So I would just want to add that the discussion is more about if, for example, Katimba Sabun and Tobias Hübinette both want the state to have more legislation about race, and they will also want the Swedish state to have more statistics about race, to ask people what race do you belong to, and we haven't had that. And my argument against that is that it encourages people to identify more with their so-called race, and it gives incentives to people to think about and first and foremost identify with the race. And I think that would be a sad turn. So it's not that you don't that I say racism does exist. Racism and discrimination exists, and we need to combat that. But this is not the way to do it.
I think it's. I just would like to jump in there. There's this idea among a lot of white people that you can actually choose what race you are in a society, and you can choose what to identify with.
So can I choose, Mr. Sabuni? Can I choose?
Race
sure, absolutely. David, hold tight for a moment. Just give Katimba just a moment. Carry on, Katimba, then we'll come back to you, David.
Yes, race is actually something that society puts upon you, because when you are a certain race, that means that you have access to power and privilege just in a way that
I'm
other
quite
races
powerful.
don't. And you don't choose that. But for a lot of white people, it's all about individuals. It's all about what you think and what values you have, and that's the way we deal with racism. But it has never worked in the past. So the only way to deal with racism is to deal with this as a structural problem. Even if white people could be nice people, it doesn't mean that racism will go away or white privilege will go away, because it's embedded in the structures. But some of these right-wingers, they don't accept that, and a lot of white people just find it unsettling to talk about race. So
all right, I hear the politics here. David, make a succinct point, because I really need to go back to the community. Go ahead.
First of all, to have race in the Swedish in Swedish law is very ahistorical. People like Mr. Sabuni would like us to think, like the world to think, that Sweden had a colonial empire akin to the British Empire, the French Empire, or the Belgian Empire, which is ludicrous. We had
I don't know if that's true, actually. I don't know if that's true. However, what I've said is that if Sweden could have had an empire like the British, they would have moved for it.
Sir, can I finish? You have had your point.
Yes,
and then you can make your rebuttal.
Okay, David, make your point. I'm going to give you just 30 seconds to make this point, because I want to go back to the community.
One small colony in the Caribbean. However, we had a large empire with colonies in the Baltic countries, for example, and Finland.
All right, so David, where are you going with this? Because I'm going back to the community. You're talking about the law in Sweden.
Mr. Sabuni is trying to implement an Anglo-Saxon debate that does not belong in Swedish society. And the debate is about race.
All right, Malika.
What I am seeing online is people talking about what this decision means for living in Sweden and what life is like in Sweden. So we got this tweet, just tweeted in a couple of minutes ago. Sweden has a huge problem with racism, this person writes. We also got a video comment from someone who gives us a little bit more detail on that. I'd like all of our guests to have a listen to this.
Contrary to the reasoning behind the government's proposal, race is a factor that continues to be a significant determinant when it comes to the person's living condition here in Sweden. In order to eliminate racial discrimination, there needs to be a deconstruction of racial hierarchy before removing race as a category. It is only by understanding how the society actually looks like rather than how it ought to be that we can attempt to change it for the better.
So he talks about the living conditions there. On the back of that, I want to read this tweet, Ivar. Katarina writes in that racialized people in Sweden are constantly bullied into proving structuralized racism exists. Please ask Arpi. She's referring to you to prove it doesn't.
It's a sort of a straw man argument. I have never said that it doesn't exist. But I want to just say that Samson Bashir, the guy in the video, he's a co-researcher with Tobias Hübinette. And in their debate article, when they argue against Ullenhag's proposal, they actually talk about different body types. They write about body phenotypes. That's a very strongly racial biology-laden language. So I would just want to push back a little bit against this notion that you want more of a race in laws and statistics, or you're not an anti-racist. There are loads of ways to be anti-racist. I am an anti-racist, and these people that want more of the race, I don't think that they have the monopoly on being anti-racists. I actually think that these kinds of policies, when you encourage people to view themselves according to their skin color, those are actually, they're well-intentioned. I wouldn't say that people are racist, but I think that the outcome is the same.
Well, I have never said that you are not an anti-racist. There are many ways of being anti-racist in Sweden as well as elsewhere. No, so that is not an issue here.
Could I add here also to the debate? I just have to say I find it comical to hear brown people talk about our colonies. People like me, David, and Tobias never had any colonies. We were colonized, and in many ways
we are
Swedish,
still colonized. We are Swedish,
we didn't have any colonies.
And you normally like to talk about Sweden and their collective guilt,
and this idea that anti-racism is about ideas, convictions, or values, then, well, probably that makes Ivar Arpi an anti-racist. But to me, anti-racism is about promoting policies that would actually do something about racial inequality. And
I want to do that as well.
So, gentlemen, just take a breath, collective breath for a moment. Gentlemen, just take collective breath for the moment. We've actually covered on Al Jazeera a couple of stories coming out of Sweden, which are really about immigration, immigrants, and how they are working in Sweden. So if you have a look at my laptop, this is a story that we looked at last year. Swedish riots point to deep social problems. Then a more recent headline, looking here, racist attacks on immigrants on the rise in Sweden. So there is a line of thought, Eva, that perhaps if you actually take the word race out of legislation, that's not helping the situation that you actually have in Swedish society right now.
This is actually, I think this is a symbolic issue more than an actual issue, because the cases you bring up there are real issues that need real action. And these are things that worry me very much. And I would say that at the same time that Sweden has become more tolerant and less racist, you have also had more mobilization in the small minority that actually is racist. And they are mobilizing more. So we have, at the same time, we have more problems with racists at the same time as the Swedish population and the Swedish society has become much less racist. And I mean, so the best way to combat racism and the discrepancy between employment for foreign-born and Swedish-born people is job market policies, not inscribing race or having quotas or affirmative action, because these policies are just symbolic, and they run the risk of exacerbating the differences and divisions in society.
The thing is that this idea that Sweden is becoming less racist is actually becoming more racist, because racial disparities socially and economically are on the increase and have been increasing for the last 30 years. However, if you measure racism in terms of asking people, how do you feel about people who are black or brown? And they say, well, I have no problem with them. If that's anti-racism, well,
but at the same time, we have had
okay, gentlemen, one at a time. So let me just hear what David had to say. David, go ahead.
First of all, I found it interesting that Mr. Sabuni refers to these brown people that speak the white man's language. That would be me. So you might as well call me on Uncle Tom. Can I finish?
So gentlemen, this is feeling, again, like I said, it's feeling very petty. Yeah. Let me go back to the Swedish Minister for Integration, because he actually mentioned, okay, we might take race out of legislation, but there is a way where we can still tackle discrimination. This is what he had to say.
For example, as we have in Sweden for the moment, anti-Semitism, or if you have that you are meeting in the street, somebody shouting at you because you're a Muslim or because you have black skin, the legislation in subject matter will be exactly as strong. For me, this is more a way of sending the signal that we want to create a society where race shouldn't be used as a term, since the idea of certain different human races is the basic idea, is one of the keystones in racism.
So that's what the Minister of Integration had to say. What is our community saying?
Online, they're also talking about the impact. So this is from Sarah. She writes in, to remove the term would severely harm the fight against discrimination. And as a lawyer, she says, it would make my job arguing cases on racial discrimination much more difficult. I really see no good coming from this. So Tobias, does this hurt the fight against discrimination?
Yeah, that is what I'm saying. And also there's another problem which, looking at Sweden from the outside, I mean, the rest of the world makes use of the concept of race in both legislation as well as in research. And Sweden has also continuously received harsh criticism from both the European Union, the Council of Europe, United Nations, and numerous NGOs for having abolished race as a discrimination ground, for example. So
what difference would this make, Tobias? What difference do you think this might actually make down on the ground? So we have a legal conversation, a conversation about race, but what difference does it make to the minorities in Sweden?
Well, there are certain groups in the Swedish society which when individuals from those groups are discriminated at, it is solely on the basis of race, because these people are more or less totally Swedish in terms of everything from language, religion, culture, ethnic aspects or whatever, and that is something which everybody in a sense knows about, I think, in this discussion, but and those groups will just continue to increase, and I'm talking about those who were born in Sweden and who grew up here, and there are certain groups that are particularly of interest here. For example, people who are adopted and people who are mixed, and also people who belong to the so-called second generation.
So Kitimba, you represent the Afro-Swedish community, and this process of taking race out of legislation has been happening for quite some time. What difference is it making?
Well, yeah, if I could add to what Tobias was saying, because it's not only about legislation, it's also about policies. So when you don't have the language of race, when you don't have that kind of analysis, then policies that addresses racial inequality will not come into effect, because no one.
But this has been happening for a decade, Kitimba. So tell me what's happened.
So no one thinks. So say, for example, the National Afro-Swedish Association. We have launched this agenda with 15 proposals that would address racial inequality in Sweden for this election. It looks something like this, and there is no understanding from the political parties, not the ones in parliament anyway, for the need, for example, for equality data. There will be statistics that will show racial disparities. And if you don't have those statistics, then you don't have any proof of anything wrong. So
he's talking about racial profiling.
Can I jump in?
So this is the kind of statistics that we have in many countries in the world. Maybe, for example, in the United States, Canada, and so on. And that's the kind of statistics that is used to put into place policies.
All right. Like, so David, hold tight. Eva, I hear you. Kitimba, wrap up. Okay. Eva, go ahead.
At the same time as some of the countries in the world are moving away from, for example, affirmative action and race-based laws, like the United States, that a lot of states are moving away from affirmative action because it doesn't solve the problems that it was intended to solve. You have people like Kitimba Sabuni or Tobias Hübinette wanting to do the exact same mistake here, but later. And I would also like to add that this discrepancy between foreign-born and Swedish-born as it comes to employment and stuff. In this period, we have had the biggest immigration in all of the Western countries. So if you look at the size of our population, I'm just saying that because it's a challenge to integrate, and it takes time. So this is a big challenge, and I would say that we need job market reforms, housing reforms, and a lot of education reforms, and we need to work at this. But to say that this is, if you look at, for example, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, countries that have very racist policies against Roma people and very discriminatory attitudes when you compare attitudes, they have less discrepancy between foreign-born and Swedish-born.
Okay.
So this is not like a silver bullet that you can solve everything with.
Okay. All right, let me just go back to community for now, and I'm going to take all of you gentlemen to the post show at stream.aljazeera.com so we can continue the conversation there. Malika?
Well, Ivar mentioned some of the reforms. Our community wants to talk about those, which we can do in the post show. So I'll leave with this tweet from Emmanuel, who says, race shouldn't be viewed mostly as negative. It's diversity also. But how about making laws that will effectively tackle racism?
All right, so Tobias Hübinette, Kitimba Sabuni, Eva Arpi and David Linden. Those are the names of our guests. If you would like to tweet them, you can do so at #AJStream, and we will put those questions to them in the post show at stream.aljazeera.com. Let me tell you about what we'll be doing on the next AJ Stream. Well, on Monday, Italy is dealing with tens of thousands of migrants from the Middle East and Africa, and they are fleeing hardship and war. And we'll find out what happens once they get to Europe. Until then, we'll see you online. Thanks for watching. Hello, This is The Stream's online post show. We've been exploring a debate happening in Sweden about government plans to remove all references of race from Swedish laws. So we have Tobias, Katimbwa, Eva and David. So gentlemen, what I was hearing was there's some personal animosity in your conversation, so I clocked that.
Not animosity, willingness to debate.
Oh, okay, willingness to debate, that's what I was hearing earlier. I was hearing a very vibrant conversation about race in Sweden. I also wanted to make sure that we understood how this was affecting people, minorities who were actually in Sweden. And those were the stories that I wasn't getting. So, Eva, tell me about how you think this laws or the taking out of race from the laws will impact real people in Sweden that you know.
Actually, I think it won't impact them that much. This is a sort of a minor thing. But it's good because it enabled us to have this discussion about race and racism in Sweden. So, but I think you need to have two thoughts in the head at the same time, because at the same time you need to acknowledge the existence of racism and discrimination that both Katimbwa Sabuni and Tobias Hübinette are talking about, and at the same time say that race and having more race in legislation and having more race-based policies is not the way to go, because then you're only strengthening that mindset, the racial mindset. So that is one thing I would like to say. So it's both.
Yeah.
Yeah, Katimbwa.
Well, I think we should be very watchful, because there is such a thing as the tyranny of small steps, and this is not something that's unique. There are other things going on at the same time. However, I'm very confident, because I see history as dialectical, and I don't think you can oppress the people forever. There was someone earlier that said that affirmative action is being removed from the United States because it's not working. No, it's actually being removed from the United States because white people don't want it to be in place, and black and brown people are not any longer in the streets.
Why don't you mention Asian people? Why don't you mention Asian people? Why don't you mention Asian people?
It's a very good thing you're mentioning Asians and Native Americans and so on and so on. But sometimes you say just black and brown. But please, let me just finish my point. And since Sweden never has had that kind of civil rights movement, that's the reason why we don't talk about race, and that's the reason why they can, implement these tyranny of small steps. But I think that, people of color are coming into consciousness in Sweden, and things will change, and I think they will change drastically. And I think people like the ones we are debating are going to be shocked by the changes, but it's going to be for the better.
I want to share some examples that our community is sharing with us of examples of what they say is racist incidents happening to loved ones in Sweden. So this is Stina who writes in that loved ones of hers have been mistreated and discriminated in stores, bar queues, airport security, and customs, when this is Stina saying, this at the same time was treated with much more respect. We've tried to report some cases, but racism is hard to prove and it's always denied. I want to follow that up with this question that we got from Ali Khan. So talking about racism on the ground, Ali says the problem is racism will carry on, and the law itself is yet another social construct. So what word will be used instead of race? David, is this just a question of terminology? What happens practically when someone suffers abuse or believes that they have? What do they report it as?
You press charges, as we have a clause in Swedish law called discrimination against, literally translated called discrimination against an ethnic group. And by the fact that we are removing race, we are not removing the term racism from our laws and from our vocabulary and so on, which most people, especially people that have a vested interest in talking about race, they like to have it still there and so forth. Otherwise, I completely agree with Ivar Arpi.
But can I say something?
I just want to.
Tobias, go ahead, Tobias, and then we'll come back to you, Eva and Katimbwa.
As we are speaking about, let's call them ordinary people, and all these complaints that are streaming in to, for example, the Equality Ombudsman. I think it's important to point out that ever since these laws against discrimination were introduced in the 1990s, there have been tens of thousands, literally tens of thousands of complaints coming into the Equality Ombudsman, but less than a dozen or so have ended up in court to the favor of the complaint. And the same is true with the Swedish law against hate speech, which is usually, not always, but very often directed towards the Jewish minority. Very, very few. I think it's around 10 cases have ended up in court.
So
and the same is true also with
the
hate crime statistics.
Right. It could be a range of different things going on there. There's more than one thing going on there. Is it because the word has been removed from the legislation, or is it maybe to do with perhaps legal support, legal representation? A lot of different things going on there. It's talking about the bigger picture rather than just a word that may or may not be in the law.
Absolutely, and I think it has very much to do with the kind of general consciousness about these issues among lawyers in Sweden, policemen in Sweden, even maybe social workers, other professionals who are involved in these cases in relation to these victims in some way or another. The knowledge level is pretty low, basically.
I mean,
to look at the outcome statistically.
Can I,
Eva was just going to hold on a minute, continue, because I actually have to go around all of you because you all have things to say all at the same time. Eva, you were next. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just like to add that we have a lot of the discussion in Sweden about race is actually just a direct import almost from the Anglo-Saxon world and especially from the United States. But in the United States, they have a very specific experience of race with the Jim Crow laws and the history of slavery. And I would say, like, if you, for example, take the debate about Obama, it was a very strange debate for a Swede to watch. That in the United States, they were discussing if he was black or not, when he had a black mother, a Kenyan father, and a white mother. And I mean, those kinds of discussion, it seems weird in a Swedish context because we don't have that history of slavery. We don't have the Jim Crow law system. So our experience, we need to develop our own vocabulary when it comes to this, because every country is different. There's a very different way to tackle race in the Caribbean islands from the United States, in South Africa and Namibia. So there's a loads of other ways we can go, but there's a very America-heavy inspiration in Sweden right now, that you're directly translating stuff from America and American experiences. And it's, I think it's a mistake.
All right, hold tight, David. Katimbo, go ahead.
I think that maybe it was a weird discussion for a white Swedish person who have never been forced to talk about race. But I'll tell you that, you know, black people in Sweden all over the world was dancing and being joyful because he was black. And then he
we are officially on a detour right now, everybody. Everybody, we have entered detour territory. Let me just bring you right back on track.
Let me get to my point.
All right, please do.
And to suggest that you can discuss racism without the term race is like suggesting that you can make a class analysis of society and not talk about the upper class or lower class or the proletariat or wherever. And of course, we don't do that as much in Sweden. And if you look at our politics as a result of that, there's no class, there's no class analysis in it, and there's no class opposition anymore. Just because we removed that from our language.
All right, so gentlemen, I have an idea that I just wanted to share with you. And my idea was, and I know Katimbo, you use the US as an example or a comparison quite a bit. So I was thinking the US, certain things that happened in law that the rest of the population hated. They didn't want to do. They didn't like the idea of being able to marry whoever you wanted to marry, regardless of what their color happens to be. To be able to live and be wherever you wanted to be, regardless of what your color happened to be. And the government, the legislation was way ahead of everybody else, and then everybody else kind of caught up. What about if that was happening in Sweden? Is that possible? Could it be the government is way ahead of everybody else, and then everybody else has to catch up?
I think so.
Yes.
So I've got David and Ivar saying yes, and Katimba's like, what?
Well, I think no chance. I mean, I don't think that the government is ahead of anybody. I mean, I think the government is totally in tune with white Swedish people.
Right.
But they're
See, I'm not saying that racism doesn't exist. I'm saying that maybe the government is way ahead of everybody else.
But no one does.
This is a tension. This is a tension within the civil rights movement as well. I mean, you have Martin Luther King talking about the colorblind society, and you have another part of the civil rights movement wanting to focus more on race and wanting separatism. So this is just this debate has just come to Sweden now, And there are two ways to be an anti-racist, and one of the factions that's represented by Ketimba Sabuni, for example, is that they want more of race, they want more separatism, they want more activism based on race. And then you have another anti-racist movement that's perhaps represented by me and David here on the show right now, but that wants more colorblindness and wants more equality between, and wants less focus on race.
Right.
Yeah, because
wanting people to marry each other.
Yeah, but no one disputes that racism doesn't exist, but some people likes it to be solved by returning to the Black Panthers and their rhetoric from the 60s, and it didn't work out. History tells us it didn't work out.
The thing is, I think that many of the things that the Black Panthers and the civil rights movement face, they have actually made gains in those things. And if it wasn't for their struggle, then things would definitely be a lot worse in the United States and in the rest of the world. So,
all right, so
as a historian, you need to be historically correct.
All right,
well,
so this is a pause. This was a pause until David just said something else. So David and Eva and Ketimba and Tobias, let this be a pause, because I feel that this is a vibrant conversation that you are just getting stuck into in Sweden, and I know we will revisit it, I'm sure, on Al Jazeera and on the stream. Meanwhile, the last word with the community.
Well, closing thoughts. Femi, you asked if the government could possibly be ahead of its people on this. Moya on Facebook thinks so. Moya says, Sweden has done great things for its native population and immigrants alike, so why not let them lead the way on this? On the other hand, on Twitter, Pontus disagrees, says, regardless of how much we despise the concept of race, it's still a reality for those living with the oppression.
So thank you to all of our guests. Let me tell you about our next AJ stream. On Monday, Italy is dealing with tens of thousands of migrants from the Middle East and Africa. They are fleeing hardship and war. We'll find out exactly what happens once they get to Europe. Until then, see you online.